As the back and forth retaliatory strikes continue between Israel and Iran, latest reports from the ground indicate that 2 people have been killed in Israel. Divya, we're learning that Iran has retaliated and at least 40 people have been injured. Iran, in fact, saying that at least 78 have been killed on its soil. That's right. This is because Israel started the war. That is what the leader of Iran has gone on to say, and that their response will not be half measured. That is really what is being said here. And of course, the big question being that what role is the United States going to play? Because Marco Rubio was heard saying this is a reaction coming out of the United States, that this was a unilateral action that's been taken by Israel, even though that the United States was informed about it, but they've gone on to say that this was important. This was in self-defense. That is the stand that Israel is taking at the moment. Absolutely, and Israeli forces as well have continued to retaliate on Iran, and Iran, on the other hand, has not stepped back either. The Israeli military, in fact, has gone on to say that the residents across the country may leave shelters, but should stay close to these shelters as the barrage of missiles from Iran continues. And Iran, remember, had launched retaliatory strikes against locations across Israel earlier, and Israel's attacks on Iranian military and nuclear targets had taken place first, like you said. Absolutely, Aarti. Of course, this is really being said in terms of the kind of missiles that were fired. These were, fired towards the nuclear plant in Israel, and that really in Iran by Israel, and that is the target that it was their nuclear site. And of course, now, Iran not, sitting back, but they have started to retaliate as well, and that is what we've seen play out since late last night. And of course, initially what reports were suggesting was that Israel had targeted all their sites, which is why they could not even retaliate, is what Israel had gone on to say. Absolutely. I'm being joined at this point by Sarah Clare, professor and foreign policy commentator. She's joining us from Los Angeles. We're also being joined by John Spencer, the chair of urban warfare studies. We'll just go to them in a minute, but let's listen into these reactions coming in from both nations first.
شهادت سرداران و دانشمندان عزیز که البته برای همه سنگین است و تعدادی از مردم غیر نظامی رو به ملت ایران به خانواده های اونها تبریک و تسلیت عرض میکنم. و اما مطلبی که مایل بودم با ملت عزیزمون در میان بذارم اینه که رژیم صهیونیستی اشتباه بزرگی کرد، خطای بزرگی کرد، غلطی کرد و عواقب او رو بیچاره خواهد کرد به توفیق الهی. ملت ایران از خون شهدای گرانقدر نخواهد گذشت، از تجاوز با آسمان کشورش صرف نظر نخواهد کرد.
Tonight I wish to speak to you, the proud people of Iran. We're in the midst of one of the greatest military operations in history, Operation Rising Lion. The Islamic regime, which has oppressed you for nearly 50 years, threatens to destroy my country, the State of Israel. The objective of Israel's military operation is to remove this threat, both the nuclear threat and the ballistic missile threat to Israel. And as we achieve our objectives, we're also clearing the path for you to achieve your objective, which is freedom. In the past 24 hours, we've taken out top military commanders, senior nuclear scientists, the Islamic regime's most significant enrichment facility, and a large portion of its ballistic missile arsenal. More is on the way.
John Spencer with us, the chair of urban warfare studies. Take us through what does this really mean for the Arab states across, particularly in the nearby areas, the impact that we are going to see playing out because of the explosions that we've heard both in Tel Aviv as well as in Tehran, and the role that the United States can play in order to de-escalate matters.
Yeah, I think the Arab nations around Iran are, of course, cautious of the situation, but also happy that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon anytime soon. And I think there's a grave difference between what has happened in Iran against the Islamic regime to what has happened in Tel Aviv. Israel struck very precisely leadership, missile ballistic sites, Natanz sites, 6 nuclear scientists, hitting apartment building, single floor, single apartment of very precise targets. The Islamic regime answered back and hit Tel Aviv apartment complexes. Sure, they're aiming for military sites. That's not what they hit. There are lots of differences. The United States has said it's still willing because this was, according to Israel, an act of preemptive self-defense, as Iran was not negotiating with the United States and others in good faith and was racing towards building a nuclear bomb and has a ballistic missile program that wants to be intercontinental. The United States has offered again to continue to have those negotiations despite this and to de-escalate the situation. But it's up to the Islamic regime, and those statements by the leadership about the regime in Israel aren't helpful, are reckless in what it's currently doing, not targeted with no specific objective other than retaliate, is concerning. To me, it's similar to Pakistan's myth of what has happened in Iran to the misinformation that they're putting out.
That's right. Stay on with us. Sarah Claire also joining us, who's a foreign policy commentator joining us from Los Angeles. Ms. Claire, now as far as the United States is concerned, they have said that this decision was entirely Israel's, but Iran again blaming US as well for what's happened.
Yes, I would say that, I'm thankful as an American that we have President Trump in the White House because he is leading, and creating conditions for peace and de-escalation. He has offered again for Iran to, come to the table and continue these negotiations. And so I think that that's a really important moment to acknowledge. And I think it's also an important to acknowledge that these Arab states are very fatigued by Iran's chaos. And so we have an actual opportunity here to conduct diplomacy. And I think it's really important that we have people that are able and willing to conduct that diplomacy.
And Mr. Spencer, what is public opinion like in the United States when it comes to the escalation between Iran and Israel? Is it shifting at the moment?
No, I've seen over 70, and again, I'm not in the field of conducting public opinion surveys, but I've seen over 70% acknowledge that Iran couldn't have a nuclear weapon, and they appreciated President Trump's, unlike past administrations, just talking about it and actually putting a 60-day window. And this attack came on the 61st day of that window. I think the majority of the American population recognizes that this needed to be happening. Of course, they're always concerned about not wanting new wars started, but this was preemptive, as in peace through strength, what we actually talk about here, and what Israel showed and helped, because it isn't death to Israel that the Islamic regime chants first. They start with death to America and then death to Israel.
Right, Sarah, well, the United States is being informed by the Israeli side that this was in self-defense. This was a preemptive measure, but could this really have been prevented?
I think that, we have to remember Israel's not acting in a vacuum here. And, in America, when I'm looking at foreign policy, I'm also looking at past US administrations. And, so there has been a kind of a lackadaisical attitude from the international community towards Iran. And that's what created the, opportunity for this situation to escalate to the point that it's at now. So I think that's one thing that's really important to remember. And the other thing that's important to remember is that this war started on October 7th, 2023. So I don't think it's a surprise that Israel is, responding to Iran, because their terror proxies in the region have been targeting Israeli civilians. So, in a way, it was kind of expected that Israel was going to have to deal with Iran at some point. Now, how they go about doing that, I think there's some debate on that, but I think it was always going to be that Israel had to deal with Iran at some point.
Right, and Mr. Spencer, The question again is now on the United States, because when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war or Israel-Gaza or Israel-Iran, questions are being raised on the United States and Trump administration now, because they've been saying that they are batting for peace and they do not want war. And he has been time and again mentioning that trade is of utmost importance. You can't do trade with countries that are at war. So then again, the questions are being raised on the Trump administration as well on what they are going to do. They can't step back and be absolved of responsibility as well.
No, I mean, it starts with, basically Israel's operation is not done. Israel set a very limited objective to roll back the Islamic regime's nuclear and ballistic missile program. They say they're not done with that. Now, Iran is targeting and has killed civilians in Israel, and they're not collateral damage because the sites that were hit weren't military, although they're close to military. So it will be hard for the U.S. administration, but I know that there's lots of conversations being had that we do want basically countries not at war, but the world couldn't have. And the United States administration was very clear on zero enrichment of nuclear fissile material. And Iran was basically trying to kick that can down the road and race to one. So it's a complex, geopolitics is complex, but terrorism is not. So, and like the other guest said, the Islamic regime in Iran built this terror network around Israel and the Middle East over decades of past administrations, knowing it's happening from Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, Islamic, Shia-backed terrorists in Iraq. That's the strength and leadership the United States could say, just like India did, with no more of this double talk with Pakistan, with Iran about, okay, I'm doing things that on the right side of history on one way, but I'm also the cause of all the chaos with my proxy terrorism to pursue my strategic goals.
Sarah, it is Donald Trump who's going to, claim forever that he can stop a war in a phone call. That is the claim that has been made, whether it was a war between Ukraine and Russia, taking claim whether it comes to the conflict we saw here between India and Pakistan. Take us through the role that Donald Trump can play here and, put his money where his mouth is in regard to perhaps help de-escalate the situation.
Yeah, I can't speak for the Trump administration, but I think just, what Americans are feeling is that we are very thankful to have an administration that wants to pursue peace. Most Americans don't want any new wars. And so to have this administration that is continuing to offer that off-ramp of negotiations and de-escalation, I know it is very reassuring for me as an American, because the Middle East has been, such a thing that America continually gets drawn into. And I think that President Trump's leadership in the White House does play a role here as well in, kind of the larger context, because he is a very strong leader and he has made his stance on peace very clear, that he expects peace and he wants peace, from the Middle East, from Russia, Ukraine. And so it's also keeping this conflict from kind of spreading throughout the region. And that's what we hope to continue to see. And I think that's, what the administration can do is to continue to put that pressure so that this conflict doesn't, spiral out of control.
Ms. Claire, now, like Mrs. Spencer was stating, Iran has leveraged its ties with terror networks in Middle Eastern states as well. So what role do now Middle Eastern countries play? Saudi Arabia, UAE, he's mentioned a couple of other nations as well. Now, they have another responsibility now when it comes, because of this escalation that has occurred.
Yes, I think that the neighboring countries, Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and maybe even some of these other Arab states, we're not necessarily expecting them to support Israel, but we are expecting them to reject terror. And that's what the Iranian regime has been exporting for so many years now. And I think that the people of the Middle East especially are wanting peace in this moment, and that the international community can really capitalize on that as well in this moment. And continue to support the people of the Middle East when they're saying, hey, we are ready for peace. And, we can continue to put pressure and de-escalate this because in the past, that may not have been the case. But right now is a really critical moment where a lot of these neighboring countries are saying, we're done with this terror, we're done with this chaos.
Right. John, we're seeing that gold prices, oil prices have gone up ever since this escalation started. We're talking about oil prices up by 7%. Take us through the impact that we're going to be seeing as far as the energy costs are concerned.
Yeah, I mean, we could see, unfortunately, an escalation if this war continues, and the impact to Iranians' main source of income, especially compared to different U.S. administrations. That oil industry and the export to China and other countries could be impacted by their escalation against Israel. And I don't think this is a tit for tat. Again, look at the targets that Israel has struck with great success. 20 senior commanders in the IRGC, to include the commander of Quds Force, whose job is to export terrorism, 6 nuclear scientists, compared to what has done. But now Iran has struck civilian sites and Israel's operation is not. That could include an escalation to infrastructure in Iran, which could further have impact on the price of oil. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And Ms. Claire, finally, last word with you. Like we were talking about, it's not just the impact on diplomacy that's going to be affected, but trade and domestic sectors are going to be affected as well. So what is the immediate impact we're looking at?
I think that, domestically in America, the main concern right now is that many people don't want a new war. So I think that's, having an effect on these tensions and whether, certain economic decisions. But as far as trade goes, I know that, we are very excited about this deal with Saudi Arabia and investments from some of these, Middle Eastern countries that the Trump administration has been working on building relationships with. So I think that also plays an important role because, as President Trump always says, these trade relationships can be a starting point for diplomacy, and they do create conditions where people are a little bit more invested in continuing those relationships.
Thank you so much, Sierra. Thank you so much, John, for joining us on the broadcast.